Petrarch is at the same time completely unique and completely ordinary. The ordinary is fairly obvious on a first reading. Some of the stuff he's doing just seems so common, so unoriginal, and in fact, a lot of what he does had been done in the past, and often in a great variety of ways. So he's not necessarily the innovator that he is sometimes made out to be, but he is also very unique because what he does with his materials is often quite unique. The fact that he appropriates an awful lot of them, but he puts a very particular spin on them that is genius. There's really no way about it, and the character of the man is emblematic of his age, which is a burgeoning interest in the self. He was a fairly vain person, you could say. His topic was always himself, but that was the case, or that would be the case, really, for poets entirely after him. It was not necessarily not the case for a lot of them before him either. The poems for which we know him most are the Canzoniere, also known as the rime sparse. He also has a Latin name for it that is quite a mouthful. The Rerum Vulgarium Fragmenta, the fragments of vulgar things, essentially. And he wrote his poems. However, he wrote this collection in Italian. He usually writes just about everything else in Latin. He was a great Latinist, and he was very proud of his classical learning. And he was a huge fan of Virgil and Ovid and Augustine and all of these great Latin writers that pop up repeatedly throughout his work. But he wrote this in Italian, in his own dialect, partly as a homage, I would say, to Dante, with whom he had a somewhat rivalrous, sometimes uncertain relationship. Petrarch is a generation or so younger than Dante, and Dante was in fact exiled along with Petrarch's father from Florence. So they had he was very much aware of Dante as a model, and there is this weird anxiety of influence going through him also. But it is the poetry that we have that is probably his greatest bequest to history. He becomes particularly noted for his elaboration of the sonnet. The sonnet existed before him, but he popularized it. He did stuff with it that packed new subtleties, new capacities into this form that hadn't really been explored before. And so the sonnet form, as it came to be known in those early years, was largely known as the Petrarchan sonnet. 14 lines, 11 syllables per line, the beginning octet or octave, usually ABBA rhyme scheme, and then a sestet or two tercets of a CDC rhyme scheme or some variation of that. He could be quite inventive with coming up with different variations. And he did that with great fluency. And the Canzoniere is largely a collection of sonnets. It is uh, 366 poems, overwhelmingly in sonnet form. There are a number of canzone songs. There are a couple other forms tossed in there as well. But it is the sonnets that really carry the work in general, and it is a unified work, not just a collection of scattered fragments, as he sometimes calls them. Um, and it tells a kind of story. It is a story essentially of his involvement with a woman named Laura. Laura is his Beatrice, if you will. The relationship itself isn't much more developed than Dante had with his lady. In that if there was a real Laura, she seems to have enamored the young Petrarch, but she was already married, and she really didn't give him the time of day. She didn't, he was spouting his devotion to her in good troubadour fashion, you might say, and she's no, not interested, and just went away. And so he was left with his rejection and his pain and his loneliness, and he conjured from her a kind of inspiration. And he characterizes that relationship very differently throughout the poem, or throughout the collection. Sometimes she is a kind of divine goddess figure who is just the perfect embodiment of beauty and inspiration and everything good. And at other times, you sense the rejection and the resentment and the coldness of her, and in fact, sometimes even a cruelty. And he lashes out against that, but through all of it, he is always coming back to himself. He is always reading the reality as a screen through which he can examine himself, and that's where the Renaissance and the humanism really starts to kick in, because it is an internal thought. He is going through his own thoughts in the process of writing these poems. And the examination of those thoughts, the examination of oneself, is the heart of humanism and the Renaissance. And he does it to great effect. The first poem in it is justly famous, and it has a simple little form that you can follow, very easy rhyme scheme. Again, A B B A, A B B A, and a little twist in the sestet. What is that? C D E C D E. Little twist off the top. He's got to be a little original. Always offering up something a little bit different, but very simple. In the translation by Robert Durling, you who hear in scattered rhymes the sound of those sighs with which I nourished my heart during my first youthful era, when I was in part another man from what I am now. For the varied style in which I weep and speak between vain hopes and vain sorrow, where there is anyone who understands love through experience, I hope to find pity, not only pardon. But now I see well how for a long time I was the talk of the crowd, for which I am ashamed of myself within. And of my raving, shame is the fruit, and repentance, and the clear knowledge that whatever pleases in the world is a brief dream. Now, initially in the English translation, you can see that it doesn't really hold to the rhyme or the meter. Petrarch's language is notoriously elliptical. His Italian can be quite a challenge to wrestle into English. And so most translators don't even try. They go for a sense of it, uh, uh, walking that fine line of translation art between interpretation and uh, literal translation. Um, but you can see an awful lot of the basic ideas he's working with here, the basic tropes. You hear in scattered rhymes. He's very big. The word scattered comes up repeatedly throughout them. The idea that this is a fragmented world that he is trying to piece together. Always look at beginnings and endings. These are the first lines. This is the first line of the first poem in his collection, and he gets the word scattered in there. And for him, the poems themselves are scattered. They are just literally perhaps lying around. He is now collecting them, having written them over a series of many years, and he is now trying to collect them and put them together in a very literal fashion. But you can also see the figural version of that, in that the world itself is somewhat scattered, is somewhat disorganized to human eyes, and he needs to try and put it together in a kind of reconstruction act for in order to understand the mind of God, if you will, very much in the vein of a Dante who was trying to make sense of his world and his fate by going around and writing his poem as a mass reconstruction project of the divine order. But you can also see some of the other themes going on here. Uh, when I was in part another man from what I am now, interesting. Here he's talking about the passage of time. He is suggesting that he has changed over time. So there's a sense of time moving on, and his uncertain relationship to that. There is a certain note of self creation in that. He seems to disdain which I nourished my heart during my first youthful error. Like, well, I was young and foolish, and the assumption then is that, well, he is now wiser and can see, so he has changed. Has he changed because he has reflected upon his youth? Has he changed as an act of self creation? Or has he changed as a kind of divine subject? Has God been the agent of the change, or has he? Well, the change in itself is a fairly modern concept. The medieval world did not really understand that things changed very much. There was no sense of change. Well, often no sense of change. So this is a strange little sense of he is uncertain in relation to his own past, uncertain in relation to his own uh, evolution, and you also sense the interiority of the work, where he is really dwelling on, well, okay, I am different. I was different then. I am different now. How does that happen? And he's clocking these developments in his own life. He is focusing on himself, the interior self. He will refer repeatedly throughout the poems to physical changes in himself. He refers a lot to the changes in his hair, presumably in its color and abundance, perhaps, as a marker of change of the passage of time. He's very good with finding little symbols to suggest things, and well, the graying of one's hair or the fleeing of it is a suggestion of the passage of time, and he can say that instead of just saying it, I got older. It's an interesting and creative, poetic image to work with. But the goal of this poem is decidedly personal too. It is all about him. He says he hopes to find pity, not only pardon. Pardon is a kind of ideal form of justice. It is somewhat impersonal. It is somewhat. It can perhaps be divine, but it is certainly a kind of absolution granted from a rather austere or idealized power. Pity is something very different. Pity is communion. Pity is identification. Pity is something that is granted to somebody's humanity and not just their existence. There's a constant demand in his poems for recognition of the humanity within. And I am ashamed of myself within because he became a talk of the crowd. Well, here I'm not so sure I buy it because there's an awful lot throughout, and this could be a pose, of course. He is striving repeatedly in his poems for a kind of recognition, for worldly fame, and yet he is always at the same time disdaining that and saying, "Well, I wasn't really after that. I was just doing it for the glory of God, for the perfection of the art, or something like that. I had no interest in honors or anything like that, and I don't buy that for a second." Uh, I don't think he was particularly horrified to be the talk of the crowd, for which he was ashamed of himself within. Again, this sense of interiority, whether you believe it or not, he is focusing on his inner state. Um, the collection is makes use of an awful lot of different poetic tropes, different themes, and ties them all together. Again, he's not necessarily dealing with any original material, but the way he weaves it and contrasts it and articulates it is that really is the innovation. That's really where he shines, and you can see that in the third sonnet of the Canzoniere. Um, Again, very simple rhyme scheme, very simple layout, very simple language. You don't even see in this one particularly, long words or anything for an Italian. Very simple, short, uh, identifiable, and almost not quite monosyllabic. You don't get a lot of monosyllabic in Italian, but very simple language. But the content itself is something quite distinct and almost grandiose. It was the day when the sun's rays turned pale with grief for his maker, when I was taken, and I did not defend myself against it, for your lovely eyes, Laura, bound me. It did not seem to me a time for being on guard against love's blows. Therefore I went confident and without fear, and so my misfortunes began in the midst of universal woe. Love found me altogether disarmed, and the way opened through my eyes to the heart, my eyes, which are now the portal and passageway of tears. Therefore, as it seems to me, it got him no honor to strike me with an arrow in that state, and not even to show his bow to you, who were armed. Um, hmm, his maker. Well, there he is talking about Christ. It was the day the sun's rays turned pale with grief for his maker. That is the day of Christ's crucifixion, and he is describing the day that he first saw Laura. And he describes it in an interesting way because he's talking about being struck by love's blows. There is a reference to a bow and arrow, so we're talking about the classical mythical figure of Cupid, uh, which is an interesting contrast to have within a poem that starts out with Christ. He's talking Christ, now he's talking about Roman paganism, and that's a interesting little mix. But of course, within that, he's using this to address autobiography. He's talking about an event in his life and putting it on that scale. He's saying, in effect, that the crucifixion of Christ was equivalent or in some way related, in a metaphorical sense, to the first time I saw you, the first time I saw Laura. Um, that's that's a big claim, especially in the late Middle Ages, early modern era. That's a big claim for an Italian. The uh, the idea is that Cupid, well, the Cupid as a mythical figure shoots a bow and arrow. Usually, the arrow enters through the eyes, as the tales are told, and then the person who is hit is in love, and so it is a wounding. It goes through the eyes, and of course, how does he first encounter Laura? But by seeing her. How do you encounter anybody for the first time? By seeing them, usually. And here especially, sight is something that is significant because we know that he never really had in the biographical sense, he never really had a developed relationship with this woman. So he is left imagining different dramas for different visions of her. And it's much easier to objectify and idealize someone when you never actually talk to them. So that's what he's dealing with here. He sees her, the pain of that experience comes through his eyes. Through my eyes to my heart. And you can see also the confusion of that moment when he invokes a kind of resentment, and even a sense of a chaotic universe at the end when he says, why did they have to hit me when you perhaps were standing right next to me and you were left unarmed or unharmed. That's curious, huh? The the poems are ripe with this kind of weaving of inspirations, this kind of taking of vastly contradictory themes at times, but making them all make sense. Usually, again, within that sonnet form, where you state a problem in the octet or in the first quatrain, you develop the problem in the second quatrain, and then there's a volta, a turn, as you go into the sestet. So it's not just the rhyme that changes, but also it starts to reflect on the problem. It starts to think about it and dwell on it, maybe propose a solution, or bring something new to the consideration. So it is a constant turning over of all of these materials that is so significant. And the moment or the role of Laura in his life as a kind of inspiration combines this Christian divine essence, but also for him always, of course, churns with classical, mythical, Roman, Greco-Roman references. Specifically, most commonly, the legend of Apollo, who in Ovid tells the story of Apollo chasing Daphne, a nymph, through the woods, and she is changed into a laurel tree. And then Apollo, who is the god of poetry after all, decides that, well, okay, if I cannot have my lady, whom I love, he was chasing her to rape her probably. If I cannot have that, then I will claim the tree as a mark of my art, as a mark of poetry. And so the laurel tree becomes or a laurel becomes an honorific, really, in poetry. If you are a public poet in the Renaissance or any time before that, going back to the classical age, you are crowned with a wreath of laurels or a crown of laurel leaves. And well, it doesn't take an awful lot of linguistic expertise to see the link between laura and laurel, even in Latin, as he dealt with so much. It's pretty close. So the Apollo myth comes up in Sonnet 34, where he dwells upon her image and her role, and also kind of her role as inspiration, but also dwells a little bit, touches on that sense of well, it's not just the female Laura, the woman that I am so enamored of, but the idea of worldly fame. And that is quite the draw for Petrarch. Apollo, if the sweet desire is still alive that inflames you beside the Thessalian waves, and if you have not forgotten with the turning of the years those beloved blonde locks, against the slow frost in the heart of and cruel time that lasts as long as your face is hidden, now defend the honored and holy leaves where you first and then I were limed. And by the power of the amorous hope that sustained you in your bitter life, disencumber the air of these impressions. Thus we shall then together see a marvel, Our Lady sitting on the grass, with her arms making a shade for herself. Well, you can see the imprint of the legend right there, the direct address to Apollo. The idea again, the arms of Daphne making a shade for herself, the arms of a tree, the branches of a tree making shade, but also the role of seeking inspiration. The assumption within that also is really quite grandiose. He in the middle he disdains the effects of time once again. He notes the corrupting and passage of time, the slow frost and harsh and cruel time. Frost again, kind of turning white, but also a kind of frost that comes in winter, which is a sign of old age, very symbolic. Okay, Petrarch, you're good at that stuff. But the idea that it lasts as long as your face, Apollo, is hidden. If Apollo's face is not hidden, if poetry is inspiring the world, does that mean that time stops? Can poetry define time or defy time? That's a big thing, because he is bidding for, Petrarch is here bidding for a kind of immortality, the immortality of worldly fame. And he's always playing with those considerations, those ambitions, and sometimes he feels bad about it, and sometimes he is coming right out and saying it. It is the contradictions that come up that are dealt with sequentially throughout the poems, but in a very organic fashion, or seemingly organic fashion, because it's not they're not necessarily consistent from one poem to the next, but it's like the whole book is a concert of these themes that he brings out at different moments as he is weaving, to bring out yet another metaphor, as he is weaving a new tapestry. Sorry. The Because he does regret his worldly hunger for fame, and his worldly lusts of all kinds, his attached to worldliness itself. He is constantly dealing with the inspiration he sees in Saint Augustine, who is a giant figure in his work. And the Augustine's wrestling with his own desires, with his own ambitions, with his own love of worldly things, as he recounts in his Confessions. That is a kind of map for Petrarch to follow and try and develop his own themes of it, his own take on it. It's an example of self-examination. Number 62. Father in heaven, after each lost day, each night spent raving with that fierce desire which in my heart has kindled into fire, seeing your acts adorned for my dismay, grant henceforth that I turn within your light to another life and deeds more truly fair, so having spread to no avail the snare, my bitter foe might hold it in despite. The 11th year, my lord, has now come round since I was yoked beneath the heavy trace that on the meekest weighs most cruelly. Pity the abject plight where I am found, return my straying thoughts to a nobler place, show them this day you were on Calgary. That's Augustinian all the way. Note that he is in effect challenging God for control of his life. He is to struggling to keep his eyes on the divine things, struggling to resist worldly temptations. And that gives him a certain empathetic quality that earns him some of the pity that he is so seeking. Again, that sense of communion, that sense of community. But that pity, is that pity from God, or is that pity from worldly readers? He is writing this in Italian. Italian is a popular vernacular language. He is not addressing this necessarily to God. Is he appealing for human pity and saying, look, I want to be good, but I can't always be because I'm a human being like you, so you guys should all identify with me and pity me for this wanting to be better, but I can't? Or is he speaking to God? There are no easy answers there. Another one that's particularly interesting is 90. For the way he plays with, again, the interplay of Laura as a figure of divine essence, and also a figure of poetic inspiration. So it splits between the romantic The value of her being romantic, the value of her being divine, the value of her being worldly and poetic. Um, because it has a fun little trope on her name. Number 90. She let her gold hair flow free in the breeze that whirled it into thousands of sweet knots, and lovely light would burn beyond all measure in those fair eyes whose light is dimmer now. Her face would turn the color pity wears, a pity true or false I did not know, and I, with all love's tinder in my breast, it's no surprise I quickly caught on fire. The way she walked was not the way of mortals, but of angelic forms, and when she spoke more than an earthly voice, it was that sang. A godly spirit and a living sun was what I saw, and if she is not now, my wound still bleeds, though the bow's unbent. That's a translation from Mark Musa. It's curious, primarily because of that first line, which is translated very differently by everybody. Again, Petrarch's a challenge for translation, but you can see the word "oughta," "lauda sparsi," sparsi scattered again. "Lauda sparsi," lauda, Laura. It means breeze, which is another word for breath or inspiration. It when taken as just orally, when you hear it, of course, though, it is pronounced Laura. So he's having some fun. He does not mention her by name in this. He paints a picture of a woman and hints at her name, but we have to infer it within it. Deciding that this is about Laura is an act of interpretation. So we are being called on to interpret this. But it is also about inspiration, about her, the value of her name, the thingness of her name, Laura. Well, yeah, that's her name, but okay, what does the name really mean? A name is just a symbol, a name is just a front, a face, a mask. What does it really mean behind it? Is it really just a human being, or is that human being herself, a kind of front for something else? What is the value behind the symbol? And he's playing with that here in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way. And it is about seeing her as she gets older, those fair eyes, and he was always dwelling on her eyes, whose light is dimmer now. She's getting up there in years, perhaps. He's not getting any closer to her, but he's watching her from afar. And later on, a godly spirit and a living sun was what I saw. And if she is not now, my wound still bleeds. She is older, and okay, maybe she's not the young hottie I remember, but I'm clinging to that memory. He is looking at the reality in front of him and seeing within it the idealism that inspired him initially. The reality for Petrarch is always just a surface. It is something to be read into, something to be mined for greater significance. Reality he really doesn't have a lot of time for. Laura as a human being, I sometimes, I have to doubt that he really cared that much. But as a symbol, as an image, as something that he can invest with meaning and draw new meaning from, that's where he likes to work. He sees the ideal within the reality in just about everything. 189, more Augustinian, more sense of being a victim of worldly desires, and some classical references thrown in there to boot. My ship laden with forgetfulness passes through a harsh sea at midnight in winter between Scylla and Charybdis, and at the tiller sits my lord, rather my enemy. Each oar is manned by a ready, cruel thought that seems to scorn the tempest and the end. A wet, changeless wind of sighs, hopes, and desires break the sail. A rain of weeping, a mist of disdain, wet and loosen the already weary ropes, made of error, twisted up with ignorance. My two usual sweet stars are hidden, dead among the waves are reason and skill, so that I begin to despair of the port. More sense of being drawn in by worldly pleasures or worldly desires. The twin threats of Scylla and Charybdis are classical references, of course, from the Odyssey, and he feels that he is trying to steer a middle course between them, but he's being drawn this way and that by these great these threats of classical antiquity, perhaps away from the true path of the Christian. Um, the At the tiller sits my lord, rather my enemy. Lord here might be a little bit of a misnomer. It is not capitalized in the Durling translation. I believe Musa translates it as my master. The And that is passion, his passions, his worldly interests, his worldly lusts, if you will, his hungers, his animal nature is driving the boat, let's say. It is in control, and he cannot rise above it. He is getting storm tossed in this great nautical imagery. He loves nautical imagery, and it ends on that image of, he is trying to get to port. The idea of port is a kind of resting place. It is ultimately heaven. The idea of a place where he will be safe and warm and dry. And the eyes, the two usual sweet stars, are Laura's eyes. His inspiration is hidden from him for some reason here, and he is feeling lost and tossed because of that inaccess. And at the end, let's say Sonnet 333, you have from after she has died, after Laura has died along the way, and he starts to further idealize her. It's probably a little bit easier now that she's not in front of him so much anymore. And the examples that he draws from are more Christian, and in some ways really much more touching, much more personal. Go, grieving rhymes of mine, to that hard stone whereunder lies my darling, lies my dear, and cry to her to speak from heaven's sphere. Her mortal part with grass is overgrown. Tell her I'm sick of living, that I'm blown by winds of grief from the course I ought to steer, that praise of her is all my purpose here, and all my business, that of her alone do I go telling, that how she lived and died, and lives again in immortality, all men may know, and love my Laura's grace. Oh, may she deign to stand at my bedside when I come to die, and may she call to me and draw me to her in the blessed place. Drawing me to her in the blessed place is putting her in the role of Beatrice in Dante, of course, to draw her to him. And there, Beatrice is summoned to help get him, into the arms of the divine, away from the wickedness of worldly goods. But this is also, again, in that first line of the poem, about the poems themselves. Go, grieving rhymes of mine. Ite rima dolente al duro sasso. Very, very simple, personal address to the poetry itself, to the scattered rhymes. The poems themselves are dolenti, they are grieving, but they are here to service the ideal of Laura, who is now, she has died. With her mortal part with grass is overgrown, and they are supposed to. The poems are supposed to, in a sense, serve as a prayer, as a vessel to Laura herself in the afterlife. So the poems are a kind of signal, but they are also a way of accessing that afterlife, accessing that divinity. Of her alone do I go telling, that how she lived and died and lives again in immortality, all men may know and love my Laura's grace. Now again, think about that word Laura, or that name Laura, or as it a word Laura. Laura as in the aura, the inspiration. The inspiration is part of his poetry, part of his worldly fame, part of his worldly desire, part of his worldly identity. What is he really worshiping here? What is he really focusing on here? It is through his efforts, through his poetry, that the idea of inspiration itself lives in immortality. He is taking on the role of, well, I am the only poet now, you could say. He is personifying poetry, which is a large claim for him to make. He's not a modest man. And consider also just that last little tercet. Oh, may she deign to stand at my bedside when I come to die, and may she call to me and draw me to her in the blessed place. Well, on a human level, he is summoning the woman who rejected him to his bedside, as if she is going to do his bidding and be his servant. A little bit of a he likes an audience. Kind of a morbid but self-gratifying theme there. But also, who comes to a bedside at death? Well, usually an emissary of divine grace. So here, Laura takes on a connotation of a kind of Christian angel. So she is both an image of the human Laura, the human being, but also a symbol of divine grace. But if he is also trying to use death as a communing with the immortality that comes through his poetry as an expression of the inspiration, aura, the inspiration, then it is again a secular and classically inspired representation of aura. All of those are all wrapped together. All of those are bringing together the knot that is Petrarch, and that is humanity writ large. And that's really the point. He is using this, and you can dispel, okay, he's kind of a melodramatic from time to time. He's a little self-involved, but that's humanity. He is using himself as a representation of humanity, perhaps in all of its flaws. Humanity is notoriously flawed. We cannot deny that. He is using himself as the patient zero of humanity. Follow my example. Consider yourself. Reflect on yourself. Reflect on your place within the world. Reflect on your place within the scope of God's creation. Reflect on your relationship to God, your distance to God, your closeness to God, your involvement with the world, your involvement with divinity. The ideal and the real, and where are you on that spectrum in between? All of that is his project. All of that is the project of the Canzoniere. All these different threads are woven together, yes, into a knot, but also into a tapestry that is art. And we are all supposed to sit there and perhaps peel apart the threads or trace them through to understand the richness of creation and the complexity of humanity itself, the richness of the human soul. And the fact that we can do that, and the fact that Petrarch himself does that within these remarkably tight little sonnets, these very organized and very rigidly structured units, is a sign of great human ingenuity, the great capacity of the human mind to trace through the workings of divinity, to read the mind of God. It's no small ambition, but Petrarch was not a unambitious or in any way small man. He is a giant, and coming to grips with him is a challenge. But he speaks in an undeniably human voice.